In the last session, we looked at the fact that Paul was rejoicing over the fact that because of his chains, because of his imprisonment, the Christians had more of a boldness, more of a faith to be able to share about what Christ did on the cross to those around. And Paul was just rejoicing over the fact that the gospel was being shared more widely and more boldly. And that is where we're going to pick up today's session. So we're in Philippians chapter 1, verse 19. For I know that this will turn out for my deliverance through your prayers and the provision of the Spirit of Christ, according to my earnest expectation and hope that I will not be put to shame in anything, but that with all boldness Christ will even now, as always, be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For me to live is Christ, and die is gain. But if I am to live on in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me, and I do not know which to choose. But I am hard pressed from both directions, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is very much better. Yet to remain on in the flesh is more necessary for your sake. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith. So this is one of those passages that it's like, hang on, what? Paul just turned around and said to live is Christ and to die is gain, and he didn't know what he was going to choose. I don't think he was going to physically do something about it himself to make the choice. I think it was more of a case that Paul was quite sick, that he was in chains. We know from over in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, he had a thorn in his side. He had something that was tormenting his spirit all the time. So I think it was more of a case that he was at the point of sickness where he could either choose to depart and have his last breath, or whether he could choose to just go, okay. When he was given the thorn in his flesh, over in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where he tells us about it, he turns around and says that God's response when he was asking God to remove it, God was basically said no and said, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. So I think it was more of a case of Paul was just sick and he had physical ailments, he had physical needs, and with that he was able to choose whether it was time to depart and go home, or whether he was actually just going to go, you know what, Christ, you've turned around and said that in my weakness you are strong, so I can keep living this life, I can keep moving on, I can keep choosing to go on in your strength. And if also in verse 12, the reason why he's saying that to die is gain is we believe that when in this passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, that he is referring to himself. Because he turns around and says, for I know this man that was called up into the third heaven. And in verse 4 it says, was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words, which a man is not permitted to speak. So Paul had a vision of heaven. He saw what heaven is going to look like. He heard what heaven is going to sound like. He knew that it was just so marvelous, so wonderful, so far beyond what we could express. And it is so glorious that he's actually not even permitted to tell us what it is like, because it is so far above our comprehension. It is with that sort of a context that Paul is able to use the words, to live is Christ and to die is gain, because Christ suffered. He suffered on the cross. Paul is suffering in jail. We know at different points he had been whipped many times. He'd been shipwrecked. He had been left naked. He'd been left abandoned. He'd been left without food. He'd also had time of plenty. So Paul suffered. And this is where it's the whole, even though he went through all of that, he had so much joy because he knew of the hope that is before him. He knew what heaven is going to be like. And he's just like, it is so wonderful that even if I have to suffer these inflictions, even if I have to suffer these pains, I want to tell everybody about how wonderful Jesus is. I want to make sure you know how good it is, because I want to spend eternity with you as well.